Hello everybody and welcome back to our video series on epistemology. By now you know that's the theory of knowledge. In this second lecture in the series we're going to tackle the problem of Gettier problems. And so I'm going to divide this second lecture into two parts, part 2a and 2b. So let's go ahead and get underway. Now by now you know that the justified true belief theory is the theory that knowledge occurs when a person has a belief whose propositional content is true, which basically means it corresponds to what's going on in reality, and that person holds the belief for reasons that are justified or has justification in terms of good reasons or good groundings for their belief. So this seems like a neat, clean theory. Why in the world do so many philosophers, in fact the universal consensus of philosophers, disagree with it? Well, the reason is simple. It all comes down to this man, Edmund Gettier. In his 1963 paper, aptly entitled Is Justified True Belief Knowledge?, Gettier argued that justification and truth were necessary properties that a belief had to have in order to constitute knowledge, but that by themselves they were not enough. Now, the neat thing is, he convinced the consensus of philosophers of his thesis, and afterwards wrote nothing else. He's still very active in philosophy, teaching students and that sort of thing, but he pretty much laid a problem out there, opened a can of worms, and forests have been leveled in the meantime trying to answer his difficulties. Let's go ahead and take a look at his counterexamples to the JTB theory. Now the first counterexample I want to call Smith and Jones in the job hunt, okay? Now Smith, he's over to the left. You can see him. He's looking kind of despondent and everything. And Jones is pretty happy because it looks like he's going to get a job from a prospective employer. Smith has, let's say in this example, good reason to believe that Jones will get the job. Jones is always honest. Jones says he's already been offered a job proposal. Actually, he's related, let's say, to the employer, and the employer tends to hire from her own family. So Smith has good reasons to be upset, but let's push the story just a little bit further. Let's suppose that in addition to this, Jones has shown Smith a little feature, pointing out his hand here. He has about 10 coins, count them, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, and he shows these to Smith before putting them into his otherwise empty pocket and going off to shake hands with his boss. Now, under the circumstances, it seems that Smith has good grounds, that's good justification for thinking the following. The man who will get the job has 10 coins in his pocket. Now, let's throw in a twist to the story. Suppose it's the case that Jones is not going to be hired after all. The employer, for whatever reason, has decided that Smith is the apt employee. Does it mean that Smith was wrong in his belief? Not necessarily. Let's throw in one more caveat here. Let's say that if we check Smith's back pocket, he has, actually, 10 coins in his back pocket. But that is unbeknownst to him because he just grabbed some coins on the way out of his house, threw them in his back pocket without even counting. It might be 7, 8, 11, 12. He can't even tell. Now, under the circumstances, what are we going to say about his belief? Well, here's one thing we can say for certain. He does have a belief. We can check that off our list immediately. Is that belief true? Well, in the sense that we've defined the term true, his belief that the man who will get the job has 10 coins in his pocket does turn out to correspond to reality. Was he justified in that belief? I think I covered that early on. He had plenty of good reasons for believing what he did. He wasn't being irresponsible in his belief formation. Now let's come to the last question here. Does he know that the man who will get the job has 10 coins in his pocket? Now, before you start meditating too much on this, remember, knowledge is a value term. We want to have knowledge. Now, would you want to have beliefs, even if they were justified and true, that were just luckily connected to reality or just luckily turning out to be true? There seems to be the wrong kind of connection between this belief and reality. In fact, we might call him, without being too harsh, the lucky dunce in this case. He wasn't being irresponsible in the way he formed his beliefs, but his beliefs are just luckily tied to the universe in a certain way. So I'd say no, he does not have knowledge. Let's go ahead and move on to a second example given by Gettier. In his 3-page paper, he gives 2 examples, and the second is the example of Smith and Jones in Barcelona. Now I'm going to put Smith over to the left again and Jones over to the right, and one thing that Smith is justified in believing about Jones is that Jones owns a Ford. Why is he justified? Well, let's say he has really good evidence. He's seen Jones driving his Ford around a lot. Jones swears by Ford. Jones won't drive anything but a Ford or buy anything but a Ford, and as far as Smith knows, Jones has always owned a car, so Smith goes ahead and forms this belief in a very epistemically responsible fashion. Now, not only that, let's move on and say that Smith is a good logic chopper. So, in addition to forming that belief, he says, three beliefs can follow from this. All I got to do is add an either or to each one of my beliefs that Jones owns a Ford. Either Jones owns a Ford or else he's located in Barcelona, Spain. Well, that has to be true because the only thing you need to make an either or claim turn out true is for one of the two disjuncts on either side of the or to turn out to be true. So you can do that for any old claim. We could say either Jones owns a Ford or else he's located in Boston, Massachusetts. Or, as Edmund Gettier points out, you could put it as Jones owns a Ford or else he's located in Brest-Litovsk. Sorry, I pronounced that incorrectly. It's actually a portion of Eastern Europe, very vaguely known, that in 1918 the Russians and Germans signed a treaty very similar to the 1919 Treaty of Versailles that ended World War I. That's just a little historical note. So it looks like he's got a lot of true beliefs, but now we're going to add a little caveat. Let's say that actually Jones does not own a Ford. It just turns out that Smith was wrong under these circumstances despite his evidence. Actually, what happened here is that Jones sold his Ford and he's in between cars. He's driving a rental right now. So it looks like all of Smith's beliefs turned out to be false, right? Well, not quite. We can add one more caveat here. Let's say that as it turns out, unbeknownst to Smith entirely, Jones actually is in Barcelona watching some bullfights. Why would he do that? Well, a sudden interest in bullfights overtook him. So let's go ahead and evaluate all of Smith's beliefs now. True, he has a lot of false ones. But look at one of the beliefs in this list of three that turns out to be true. It is true that either Jones owns a Ford or else Jones is in Barcelona. So we have a belief here. Check it off. Is it true? Yes, it is. Is Smith justified in believing that? Well, it seems that he's justified in believing that Jones owns a Ford to the best of his evidence, and he knows his logic here that the either-or claim in question follows from that. So here's the question. If we have a justified true belief here, does Smith have knowledge of Jones, or knowledge, we should say, of this disjunctive claim? What we have here, I hate to put it so crudely, but another case of the lucky dunce. His beliefs are connected to reality, but it seems that they're only luckily connected to reality. They're not connected in the right way that we would want. And knowledge is a value term. Knowledge is something that we want. So it seems here we have a counterexample once again to the JTB theory. Now, I can't resist one more example here because Keith Lehrer, the author of Why Not Skepticism, gives a great example called Know Got and Have It. So I'm going to go ahead and walk us through that. Let's bring in this person, an office manager and an employer. Here's an interesting thing about him and his employees. Among his employees are two employees, including Mr. No-Got. Mr. No-Got takes pride in his appearance, you can tell, and there's Have It over to the employer's right, your viewer's left. And let's just throw in a third employee here just to make the situation look nice and clean. Now, all of a sudden, people are paying attention to the fact that there's a new Ford, a Mustang, on the premises, and people are wondering who exactly owns that Ford. And No-Got, let's say, is quick to take credit. The employer pays attention to the fact that No-Got has some evidence. Well, for example, he can show up with keys, he can show up with the title, and upon close examination, we can say the employer can justifiably believe one of my employees owns a Ford. Seems like he's perfectly justified under those circumstances. But let's just say in this case, the problem is that the Ford actually belongs to Have It. Well, under those circumstances, what do we get? Let's move on to the question of, did the employer know that one of his employees owned a Ford? One thing we can check off is that he had a belief, and moreover, we can say, was he justified? Well, look at all the evidence that No-Got lined up for him. So, the third question, was it a true belief? Yes, it was. One of the employees did own a Ford, just so happened it was Have It. What does Keith Lehrer have to say about this? Is this proposition, one of my employees owns a Ford, an example of knowledge? No way, he says. And I think we both believe that, yeah, once again, we have a case of a lucky dupe. Now, inevitably, when students encounter these sorts of examples, they try to diagnose the problem with the JTB theory. Maybe the problem was with the premises. Most students catch on to that pretty quickly. We got a lot of persons who are lucky dunces, but in what sense were they lucky in a way that threw off their knowledge claims or their potential for knowledge? Well, it seems as though the problem is they started with false premises. In the first example we looked at, we had an epistemic agent who believed that Jones would get the job and deduced from that and the fact that Jones had 10 coins in his pocket that the man who will get the job has 10 coins in his pocket. The same happened in our second example. We had an agent who said Jones owns a Ford, and then he moved to the conclusion either Jones owns a Ford or he's located in Barcelona. But he started with a false premise. And in the third example we looked at, apparently it seems that the employer in question believed that Nogot owned a Ford, when in fact Nogot didn't, and then deduced from that that one of his employees owned a Ford on the basis of a second premise that Nogot was one of his employees. Can we solve the problem with the JTB theory just this simply? Well, this has been called the no false belief solution to the problem. And so on this view, all we need to do is add a new rule that knowledge amounts to justified true belief plus the caveat that the belief in question was not caused on or based on a false belief. For example, the belief that Nogot owns a Ford. Now, this was a popular solution immediately, but Carl Genet, and pictured at the top, and Alvin Goldman later gave Gettier cases in which this doesn't seem to work, because they gave compelling examples in which a person doesn't do reasoning from premises to conclusions at all, and still they end up looking like, to use my terminology, the lucky dupes. Let's look at one famous example of this given by Alvin Goldman. This example is called the fake barns example. We're supposed to imagine a county in the U.S. where the locals compete to make the best papier-mâché barns that they can and make them look as lifelike as possible. The locals have been doing this for a while, and they're very good at it. Now let's make another assumption. Suppose there's a person who drives on through that town and starts to look around at all the barns and sees a lot of fakes and gets fooled quite a bit. But then looking out the side of their car, they say, hey, there's a nice barn. It looks like they've formed a belief, and let's just say in this case, the barn they're looking at is actually real. Now, what's going on here? Let's go ahead and take a close examination. Now, does this agent in question form a belief? Yes, they do. They form a belief about a particular barn. And is it true? Well, they formed a lot of false beliefs down the road, but this particular case, it looks like they latched onto the truth. And here's a key. Are they justified in that belief? Now, before you answer no, consider this. How many beliefs do you accept just on the basis of your perception, your eyesight? What justifies your belief that there's, I don't know, a desk in front of you or a computer in front of you, if not just the fact that you're looking at it? We take perception to justify really quickly an awful lot. So consequently, the fourth question here, was this belief not based upon false beliefs? Seems right. It seems to be based instead upon an inference made immediately upon perception, or perhaps no inference at all. Here's another good example of this. Roderick Chisholm's Sheepdog. In Roderick Chisholm's example, we're asked to consider a sheepdog that's dressed to look actually like a sheep. So let's put some clothes on this sheepdog and go ahead. Now, in this case, a person's driving along, much as in our last example, and he's looking in a field and he says, hey, that field has a sheep in it. But he's really looking at the back end of this sheepdog who's looking extremely sheepish. Now, here's what's going to happen in this example as you look at the sheep to the right, who are cleverly hidden behind some rocks out of the passerbier's view. First of all, we can ask, does the person have a belief? Yes, he has the belief that the field has a sheep in it. Is he justified in that belief? Well, like in the last example, he seems to be justified on the sheer basis of the fact that he's looking at something very sheep-like. And is it true? Yes, it is. There just so happens, luckily enough, to be a sheep somewhere hidden in that field. And the fourth issue, was this belief not based upon false beliefs or premises? It was not so based. It was based upon an immediate belief formed upon perception. Now this creates a real problem. I'm going to use an example or some examples given by Feldman in another context because he has some really nice examples. We form beliefs on the basis of perception immediately, and we do so all the time, not on the basis of arguing ourselves into them. He uses the example of an umpire at one point. An umpire has to make calls as to whether something is a strike or a ball, and has to do so immediately. There's not even enough time for that umpire to think. But in those cases, he makes a lot of very clear calls in which he's rationally justified to call the way he did. And as long as that's true, you can see that perception creates an issue for these Gettier problems. Or consider this example. Some people are really good at just looking at trees and telling whether or not they're, say for example, maple trees. Can you spot the maple tree out of this batch? I'll give you a hint. It's the brown tree in the middle. Now, for people like you and me who are not very good at spotting maple trees, perhaps we'd have to count the points on the leaves and things of that nature and their discoloration at a certain time of year in order to know, and maybe we'd have to argue ourselves into the belief that it's a maple tree. Persons familiar with the woods can just look at it and tell. And that's another example of a belief formed upon perception rather than upon argumentation. So these seem to create problems for the justified true belief theory and the no false assumptions solution. Now here's a proposal. How about instead of the JTB theory, we say that a belief counts as knowledge when we have a belief plus truth plus justification plus no false premises, and then we'll try to come up with something to handle these cases, the likes of which Carl Genet, Alvin Goldman, and Roderick Chisholm has given us. Before you move to this make this maneuver, basically, let's go ahead and stop for a minute and propose whether or not the no false beliefs or no false premises criterion should even be included. Marshall Swain has an example involving a marriage. Is the new requirement that we introduced even necessary for knowledge? Should it even be in our list of criterion? He gives this example. Suppose two people are married by a justice of the peace, maybe at a cheesy hotel in Vegas, a week before their elaborate wedding ceremony is supposed to be conducted. Now, a person within the congregation, after seeing a perfectly conducted, elaborate wedding ceremony, bases his belief that they are married on the false belief that they were married this afternoon. Now, do I, sitting in the congregation and not knowing that they had that cheesy Vegas wedding a week before, know that they are married? Well, now here's the scenario I'm thinking of. Two persons get married, and a person in the congregation later on sees their elaborate wedding ceremony and forms the false belief that they just got married today, that they were not married before, so to speak. Now, he draws the conclusion that they are currently husband and wife, and he seems to be justified in that conclusion, does he not? Does he know they are currently husband and wife? Well, how could it be otherwise if he saw a perfectly conducted wedding ceremony? But he based his belief that they are currently husband and wife on a false belief. Here we have a case of overdetermination. Whether or not they did or did not have that cheesy Vegas wedding before, regardless of the case, then they are currently husband and wife. Whether it's true or false, they had the cheesy wedding. So it looks as though instead of having the no false premises criterion on our list, we should just X that out altogether and try to find the something extra that beliefs need to have straight across the board in addition to justification and truth that makes them candidates for knowledge. Do you see how the problem's getting more and more thick as we go? Well, let's just conclude the matter. Looks to me like Edmund Gettier has opened quite a can of worms, and philosophers have been doing a whole lot in the meantime to try and solve the problems. If you think you can solve them, go ahead and give it a try. Great minds have tried to do it, and the project is still going strong, and there's no hope of consensus yet in sight. I wish you the best.